Hey everyone, tonight we're settling in for a very long journey through one of history's most sprawling stories, the rise and fall of Rome. Now, before you get too comfortable under those blankets, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these long-form historical narratives for sleep, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see our global community settling in for the night with some ancient history. Now dim those lights. Maybe adjust your pillow, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to trace the story of Rome from a small, unremarkable city by a muddy river to the master of the Mediterranean world. And then, because this is history, we'll watch it all slowly crumble away. It's a story spanning over 2,000 years, filled with legendary figures, massive battles, political intrigue, and the kind of slow, inevitable decay that makes for perfect bedtime listening. Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, the 7 hills beside the Tiber River in the 8th century BC. There's nothing particularly special about this place. No grand monuments, no marble temples, just some scattered huts and the occasional shepherd. Yet from these humble beginnings would grow an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from Portugal to Persia. Tonight, we'll explore how that happened, and why it couldn't last forever. But let's start at the very beginning, with the Romans themselves and the stories they told about their origins. Because like many ancient peoples, the Romans weren't entirely sure where they came from. Historical records from their earliest centuries had been lost when Gallic tribes sacked and burned their city in 390 BC. So what we have instead are legends, carefully crafted stories that tell us less about what actually happened and more about what the Romans wanted to believe about themselves. According to Roman legend, their story begins not in Italy, but with the fall of Troy. When that great city burned, a Trojan prince named Aeneas escaped with a small band of followers. After years of wandering, he arrived in Italy, where he married into a local royal family and founded the city of Alba Longa. His descendants ruled there for 400 years, until 2 brothers, Numitor and Amulius, came to blows over the throne. Amulius won, deposing his brother and making Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, to ensure the royal bloodline would end with her. This was always a questionable strategy in a world where gods regularly intervened in human affairs. Sure enough, Mars, the god of war, visited Rhea Silvia and gave her twin sons, Romulus and Remus. When Amulius discovered the twins, he ordered them to be drowned in the Tiber River. But the servants, perhaps moved by pity or fear of the gods, simply left the babies by the riverbank. There, according to legend, they were found by a she-wolf who nursed them until shepherds discovered the children and raised them as their own. The twins grew up strong and bold, eventually learning their true heritage and overthrowing the usurper Amulius. With their grandfather restored to power, Romulus and Remus decided to found their own city near the spot where they had been abandoned. But as so often happens when brothers share power, they quarreled. During a dispute over the boundaries of their new settlement, Romulus killed Remus, becoming the sole founder and first king of what would be called Rome, in his honor. The story continues with Romulus facing an immediate problem. His new city needed people. So he opened Rome's gates to exiles, escaped slaves, and assorted outcasts from across Italy. These early Romans then faced another problem, a shortage of women. To solve this, they invited the neighboring Sabine tribe to a festival, and then, during the festivities, abducted the Sabine women en masse. This episode, known as the Rape of the Sabines, led to war, but eventually the 2 peoples were united under Romulus's rule. After Romulus, 6 more kings supposedly ruled Rome. The last 3 came from the Etruscan city of Tarquinii, including the final king, Tarquin the Proud, whose arrogance and tyranny so angered the Romans that they drove him out and established a republic in 509 BC. From there, according to legend, Rome was destined to conquer Italy and then the Mediterranean world. Now, as bedtime stories go, this origin tale has everything: divine intervention, abandoned babies, nursing wolves, fratricide, mass kidnapping, and the overthrow of tyrants. It's dramatic, memorable, and utterly convenient for later Roman propaganda. But it's almost certainly not true, at least not in the way the Romans told it. Archaeological evidence suggests Rome developed gradually from several small settlements that eventually merged, not from a single founding moment in 753 BC. Yet these myths tell us something crucial about Roman identity. They reveal a people who saw themselves as survivors and scrappy underdogs, descendants of Trojan refugees and abandoned infants who had clawed their way to greatness through determination and divine favor. They were comfortable with the idea that their city had been founded by outcasts and misfits, that violence had been present from the very beginning, and that their strength came from absorbing and integrating foreign peoples. Most importantly, the story established two core Roman values that would persist for centuries: an openness to new citizens regardless of their origins, and an absolute hatred of kings. The Roman Republic that emerged from these legends would be defined by both traits: welcoming foreigners while maintaining a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one man from accumulating too much power. The Roman Republic that supposedly began in 509 BC was, at least initially, a fairly modest affair. Rome controlled only a small territory around the city itself and was constantly at war with its neighbors, the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the south, and various other Italian tribes scattered across the peninsula. These early centuries of Roman history are poorly documented, but they appear to have been defined by slow, methodical expansion and the gradual development of Roman institutions. The government of the early republic was a complex mixture of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. Executive power rested with two consuls, elected annually to prevent either from accumulating too much authority. The judicial system was managed by praetors, while quaestors handled state finances and aediles were responsible for maintaining the city itself. The Senate, composed of former magistrates, technically had no legal power to make laws, but its opinions carried enormous weight and were usually implemented by the relevant officials. This system was designed to be deliberately slow and cumbersome, requiring cooperation and compromise rather than quick, decisive action. Initially, all of these positions were held by patricians, members of Rome's hereditary nobility. But the plebeians, who made up the majority of the population and the army, gradually demanded political rights of their own. They achieved this through a series of strikes, literally refusing to serve in the military until the Senate granted them concessions. By 287 BC, the plebeians had won the right to marry patricians, to hold their own assemblies, to elect their own representatives called tribunes, and eventually to serve as consuls, praetors, and other magistrates. In theory, at least, the Roman Republic had become a system where merit mattered more than birth. This mixed constitution, as the historian Polybius called it, was one of Rome's greatest strengths. It forced different classes and interests to work together, created multiple checks against tyranny, and allowed for gradual reform rather than violent revolution. The flexibility of Roman institutions would prove crucial as the small city-state gradually became the master of the Mediterranean world. But all of this political development was happening against a backdrop of almost constant warfare. Rome's strategy during these early centuries was essentially defensive expansion. They would never attack anyone unprovoked, they claimed. But if they suspected that someone might attack them, they would strike first in self-defense. This doctrine of preemptive retaliation allowed Rome to justify wars of conquest, while maintaining the fiction that they were always fighting just wars blessed by the gods. The process was slow and methodical. Rome would defeat an enemy, impose a treaty that was relatively generous by ancient standards, and then gradually integrate the defeated peoples into the Roman system. Unlike many ancient conquerors who simply enslaved or exterminated their enemies, Rome offered a path to citizenship and inclusion. This policy created a growing network of allies and eventually fellow citizens who had a stake in Rome's success. By 280 BC, this patient strategy had brought most of central and southern Italy under Roman control. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia, seeing the writing on the wall, called for help from Pyrrhus, an ambitious king from Epirus. Pyrrhus was a brilliant general who won 2 battles against the Romans, but his victories were so costly that he abandoned his campaign and returned to Greece. His name lives on in the phrase Pyrrhic victory, a win so expensive it might as well be a defeat. With Pyrrhus gone, Rome conquered the remaining Greek cities and found itself master of the Italian peninsula. But this expansion brought them into conflict with Carthage, the great maritime power that controlled much of the western Mediterranean. The resulting Punic Wars would test Roman determination like nothing before and establish Rome as a truly Mediterranean power. Carthage was everything Rome was not. Where Rome was a land power built on citizen soldiers, Carthage was a maritime empire sustained by trade and staffed by mercenaries. Where Rome was relatively young and crude, Carthage was ancient and sophisticated. Where Rome absorbed conquered peoples, Carthage was content to dominate them economically. The two powers had coexisted peacefully for centuries, but the expansion of Roman influence into Sicily inevitably brought them into conflict. The First Punic War began almost by accident in 264 BC, when both Rome and Carthage intervened in a local dispute in Sicily. The war lasted 23 years and was fought primarily at sea, which presented Rome with an immediate problem. They had no navy to speak of. But rather than accept defeat, the Romans did what they did best. They adapted. Roman engineers studied wrecked Carthaginian ships and reverse-engineered an entire fleet. They trained their crews on dry land, practicing rowing on wooden platforms. When they finally took to the water, Roman naval tactics were crude but effective. They built bridges on their ships to turn sea battles into land battles, where Roman soldiers could use their superior fighting skills. The Romans lost entire fleets to storms and inexperience, but they kept building new ones. Carthage, despite being the superior naval power, simply couldn't match Rome's determination and resources. The war finally ended with Roman victory and the acquisition of Sicily as Rome's first overseas province. But Carthage wasn't finished. While Rome was distracted by wars against Gauls and Illyrians, the Carthaginians expanded into Spain under the leadership of Hamilcar Barca, seeking new sources of silver to rebuild their power. Hamilcar's son Hannibal grew up hating Rome and dreaming of revenge. In 219 BC, Hannibal attacked Saguntum, a Roman ally in Spain. When Rome declared war, Hannibal did something unprecedented. He marched an army, complete with war elephants, over the Alps and into Italy itself. The sight of these massive creatures, unknown in Italy, struck terror into Roman hearts. Most of the elephants died crossing the mountains, but their psychological impact was enormous. For the next 16 years, Hannibal rampaged through Italy, winning battle after battle through superior tactics and generalship. His greatest victory came at Cannae in 216 BC, where he encircled and annihilated a Roman army twice the size of his own. Perhaps 50,000 Romans died in a single day, the worst defeat in Roman history. Any other state would have surrendered. Rome's response was essentially to shrug and raise new armies for the following year. This Roman refusal to admit defeat, even in the face of catastrophe, was perhaps their greatest strength. They couldn't match Hannibal's tactical brilliance, so they simply refused to give him the decisive battle he needed. Instead, they shadowed his army, attacked his supply lines, and gradually wore him down. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Scipio had been sent to Spain, where he systematically conquered Carthaginian territories and cut off Hannibal's reinforcements. Scipio studied Hannibal's tactics at Cannae and learned how to turn them against their creator. When he finally invaded North Africa, Hannibal was forced to return to defend Carthage itself. The two generals met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. According to the historian Livy, they had a meeting the night before the battle, where Hannibal, perhaps sensing his approaching defeat, spoke philosophically about the fickleness of fortune and asked for peace. Scipio replied that while he respected his opponent, he had come too far to turn back now. The battle was hard fought, but Scipio's tactics prevailed. Hannibal's defeat ended the Second Punic War and established Rome as the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. Scipio was hailed as Africanus for his victory, but perhaps more importantly, the war had proven Roman resilience. They had suffered defeats that would have destroyed any other state, yet they had endured and ultimately triumphed. The Third Punic War, 50 years later, was less a war than an execution. Rome had grown suspicious and resentful of Carthaginian recovery, and the elderly Senator Cato ended every speech with the phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." In 146 BC, Roman armies besieged Carthage, captured it, sold its population into slavery, and razed the city to the ground. Later writers would claim that the Romans salted the earth to ensure nothing would ever grow there again, though this is probably legend. But symbolically, it captured the thoroughness of Roman victory. The Punic Wars transformed Rome from a regional Italian power into the master of the Mediterranean. But they also began to change Roman society in ways that would eventually prove destructive. Long military campaigns had disrupted traditional farming, concentrating land in the hands of the wealthy while impoverishing small farmers. The influx of slaves from conquered territories further undermined free labor. Most dangerously, the wars had created a class of professional generals whose loyalty was increasingly to their armies rather than to the state. With Carthage destroyed and the Western Mediterranean secured, Roman attention turned eastward to the Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander the Great's collapsed empire. These wars were different from Rome's earlier conflicts. Where the Punic Wars had been a matter of survival, the Eastern Wars were wars of choice, fought for glory, plunder, and strategic advantage. Macedonia fell first, its phalanxes no match for the flexibility of Roman legions. The Seleucid Empire in Syria and Anatolia was the next to feel Roman power, its armies scattered and its territories annexed or reduced to client kingdoms. Egypt, weakest of the successor states, submitted peacefully and became a Roman protectorate. Perhaps most significantly, Greece itself was conquered in 146 BC, the same year Carthage was destroyed. The Roman sack of Corinth, with its priceless artworks and libraries, shocked the civilized world. But Rome was no longer content to be seen as a crude Italian upstart. They began systematically looting Greek art and culture, shipping statues, paintings, and libraries back to Rome. This cultural conquest was as important as military victory. Greek philosophy, art, literature, and architecture flooded into Rome, transforming Roman society. As the poet Horace would later write, "Captive Greece captured its savage conqueror." The Romans might have conquered Greece militarily, but Greek culture conquered Rome intellectually. By 100 BC, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean basin, which they began calling Mare Nostrum, our sea. Trade flowed freely between provinces. Roman law brought order to diverse peoples, and Roman engineering, roads, aqueducts, and harbors bound the empire together. For the first time in history, the entire Mediterranean world was united under a single government. But this rapid expansion created new problems. The traditional Roman system of government had been designed for a city-state, not a world empire. Provincial commands gave individual Romans enormous power and wealth, creating opportunities for corruption and abuse. The influx of slaves from conquered territories disrupted traditional Roman society, while the wealth flowing in from tribute and plunder created vast inequalities. Most dangerously, the army was changing. Roman legions had traditionally been composed of citizen farmers who served for a few years and then returned to their fields. But long campaigns in distant provinces made this system impractical. Increasingly, Rome relied on professional soldiers whose primary loyalty was to their commanders rather than to the state. These veteran legionaries looked to their generals for retirement benefits, land grants, and protection. This created a volatile situation where ambitious politicians could build personal armies and use them to intimidate their opponents. The Roman Republic, which had survived foreign invasions and external threats, now faced its greatest challenge from within. The seeds of civil war had been planted in the very success of Roman conquest. The crisis of the Roman Republic began, ironically, with an attempt at reform. In 133 BC, a young tribune named Tiberius Gracchus proposed to redistribute public land to Rome's growing population of landless poor. The idea wasn't revolutionary, such laws had existed before, but the concentration of wealth and land in the hands of a few senators had reached crisis proportions. The problem was that many of the senators who would vote on the law were precisely the wealthy landowners who would lose property if it passed. When a fellow tribune vetoed the proposal at the Senate's urging, Tiberius had him deposed, an action that was technically legal but unprecedented. When Tiberius ran for re-election to protect himself from prosecution, his enemies in the Senate decided to take direct action. On election day, the Pontifex Maximus and a group of senators armed themselves with clubs and staves and attacked Tiberius and his supporters. In the ensuing melee, Tiberius was beaten to death, along with 300 of his followers. It was the first time in Roman history that political disputes had led to bloodshed in the city itself. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius became tribune and attempted even more radical reforms. He redistributed grain to the urban poor, reformed the court system to reduce senatorial corruption, and proposed extending citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. For a time, he was the most popular politician in Rome, but his proposal to grant citizenship to non-Romans proved deeply unpopular with existing citizens. When riots broke out in 121 BC, the Senate passed its first Senatus Consultum Ultimum, essentially a declaration of martial law that authorized the consuls to use any means necessary to restore order. Gaius and his supporters fortified themselves on the Aventine Hill, but they were overwhelmed by senatorial forces. Gaius died in the fighting, along with 3,000 of his followers. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers marked a turning point in Roman history. Political violence, once unthinkable, became commonplace. The weapons used in these conflicts escalated from clubs to swords to armies. Within a generation, Roman commanders would be marching their legions into the city itself. The final century of the Republic saw a series of increasingly destructive civil wars. Marius and Sulla, two successful generals, fought for control of the state, with Sulla ultimately establishing himself as dictator and purging his enemies through proscription lists, essentially legalized murder backed by the state. When Sulla retired, thinking he had restored order, the cycle of violence simply resumed. The root problem was that the Roman constitution had no mechanism for resolving fundamental disagreements peacefully. When the normal channels of politics became blocked by obstruction and veto, ambitious men turned to force. And once violence became an accepted tool of politics, there was no going back. Into this toxic environment stepped three of the most famous figures in Roman history: Pompey the Great, Marcus Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Their informal alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, was intended to pool their resources and influence to achieve their individual goals. Instead, it set the stage for the final destruction of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar was born into an aristocratic family that claimed descent from the goddess Venus, but his father had never achieved the consulship, leaving young Gaius with something to prove. In Roman society, nobility had to be earned as well as inherited. You weren't truly noble unless you matched or exceeded your ancestors' achievements. Caesar's path to power began with the recognition that politics in the late Republic required three things: military glory, enormous wealth, and popular support. He achieved the first through his conquest of Gaul, a campaign that added all of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Britain to the Roman Empire. The wealth came from the plunder of these campaigns, while popular support was won through generous gifts, games, and public works. But Caesar's most famous characteristic, the one that would ultimately destroy him, was his refusal to accept limitations. When pirates captured him as a young man and demanded 20 talents of silver as ransom, Caesar laughed and told them to ask for 50. He was worth more than their petty sum. While waiting for the ransom to arrive, he joked with his captors, wrote poetry, and promised to return and crucify them all, which the pirates found hilarious. When Caesar was released, he immediately raised a fleet, captured the pirates, and had them crucified, just as he had promised. But he showed mercy by having their throats cut first, so they wouldn't suffer. This combination of ruthless determination and calculated clemency would define his entire career. Caesar's partnership with Pompey and Crassus gave him the consulship in 59 BC, which he used to pass legislation benefiting his allies, while systematically breaking every constitutional norm that stood in his way. When his fellow consul tried to oppose him, Caesar had the man's head dunked in a basket of filth. When tribunes tried to veto his laws, Caesar ignored them. When opponents protested, Caesar filled the forum with armed soldiers. It was all technically legal. Caesar held imperium, the supreme authority of a Roman magistrate, which made him untouchable while in office. But everyone understood that once his consulship ended, he would face prosecution for his illegal acts. Caesar's solution was to secure a provincial command that would keep him safely outside Rome, with Imperium intact, until he could run for consul again. The command he obtained was the governorship of Gaul, a position that came with 4 legions and the opportunity for military glory. What followed was 8 years of almost constant warfare as Caesar systematically conquered Celtic tribes, crossed the Rhine to intimidate German peoples, and even invaded Britain twice. His commentaries on these campaigns became models of Latin prose and masterpieces of self-promotion. But while Caesar was winning glory in Gaul, the political situation in Rome was deteriorating. Crassus died fighting the Parthians, eliminating one member of the triumvirate. Pompey, jealous of Caesar's success and worried about his growing power, began moving toward the senatorial party. When Caesar's enemies in the Senate attempted to recall him from Gaul before he could run for consul again, Caesar faced a choice: return to Rome as a private citizen and face almost certain prosecution, or cross the Rubicon River with his army and march on Rome. Caesar chose war. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon with his 13th legion, supposedly uttering the famous phrase, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. Pompey and most of the Senate fled to Greece, where they raised an army to oppose Caesar. The civil war that followed would rage for 4 years and fundamentally transform the Roman world. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus in 48 BC effectively ended the Republic, though Caesar maintained the fiction that he was restoring rather than destroying Roman institutions. He pardoned most of his enemies, reformed the calendar, redistributed land to his veterans, and launched ambitious building projects. But his most significant act was his appointment as dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, in 44 BC. This was a step too far for many Romans. A group of senators, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, conspired to assassinate Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BC. According to legend, a soothsayer had warned Caesar to beware that day, and his wife Calpurnia had begged him not to go to the Senate. But Caesar went anyway, either from courage or arrogance. When the conspirators surrounded him and began stabbing, Caesar fought back until he saw Brutus among his attackers. Then, according to some accounts, he covered his head with his toga and allowed himself to be killed. The man who had pardoned his enemies after their defeat was betrayed by those who had benefited from his clemency. The assassination of Caesar was intended to restore the Republic, but it achieved exactly the opposite. Caesar had been popular with the people, and his death created a power vacuum that could only be filled by force. The conspirators had killed the dictator, but they had no plan for what came next. Within hours, it was clear that they had not saved the Republic. They had merely ensured that it would die even more violently. When Caesar was assassinated, few people paid much attention to his 18-year-old grandnephew, Gaius Octavius. The young man was studying in Greece when he learned of his great-uncle's death and his own adoption in Caesar's will. But Caesar had given Octavius something more valuable than money or property: his name. From that moment forward, the teenager would be known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Caesar's heir. The transformation of this sickly youth into Augustus, Rome's first emperor, is one of the most remarkable political achievements in history. Octavian, as historians call him, had no military experience, no significant political connections, and no obvious talents beyond a shrewd understanding of Roman psychology and an absolute ruthlessness in pursuing his goals. His first challenge was Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and consul, who had seized Caesar's papers and treasury and was positioning himself as the dictator's successor. But Octavian had Caesar's name and will, which proved more powerful than Antony's official position. When Octavian arrived in Rome and began paying Caesar's bequests to the people, he was seen as the true heir to the dictator's legacy. The complex maneuvering that followed saw Octavian alternately allying with and fighting against both Antony and the Senate. When it served his purposes, he joined with the senators against Antony. When that was no longer useful, he marched on Rome with 8 legions and demanded to be made consul at age 19, decades younger than the legal minimum. The second triumvirate, formed by Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus in 43 BC, was a very different affair from the first. Where Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had been informal allies, the second triumvirate was legally recognized and given dictatorial powers for 5 years. Their first act was to draw up prescription lists of their enemies, essentially legalized murder on a massive scale. Over 300 senators and 2,000 equites were condemned to death, their property confiscated to fund the triumvir's armies. Among the victims was Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, whose head and hands were nailed to the speaker's platform in the Forum. The prescriptions eliminated the triumvir's enemies while providing the money needed for their war against Caesar's assassins. The defeat of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BC ended the last hope of restoring the Republic, but it also set up a final confrontation between the two surviving triumvirs. Lepidus was pushed aside, literally exiled to serve as a powerless priest, leaving Octavian and Antony to divide the Roman world between them. For more than a decade, the two men maintained an uneasy peace while building their strength. Antony controlled the wealthy eastern provinces and formed an alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, the last Ptolemaic pharaoh. Their relationship was both political and personal, producing Octavian, meanwhile, consolidated his hold on Italy and the western provinces. He faced constant challenges: food shortages, veterans demanding land, the son of Pompey disrupting shipping with his fleet. But he gradually overcame each obstacle. His greatest asset was Marcus Agrippa, a military genius who served as Octavian's general and engineer, building fleets and winning battles while his master focused on politics. The final break came when Antony divorced Octavian's sister Octavia and publicly married Cleopatra, confirming what everyone already knew about their relationship. But the real scandal was Antony's will, which Octavian somehow obtained and read to the Senate. In it, Antony bequeathed Roman territories to his children with Cleopatra and requested to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. This was the propaganda weapon Octavian had been waiting for. He portrayed the coming war not as a civil conflict between Romans, but as a foreign war against Cleopatra and her corrupting influence over Antony. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC was almost anticlimactic. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet broke and fled before the fighting had really begun. Both committed suicide rather than face capture and humiliation in Rome. With their deaths, Octavian became sole master of the Roman world at age 32. But unlike Caesar, who had flaunted his power and been assassinated for it, Octavian understood that Romans would accept autocracy only if it was disguised as the restoration of traditional government. In 27 BC, Octavian appeared before the Senate and dramatically restored the Republic, returning his extraordinary powers to the people and their representatives. The grateful senators immediately voted him new honors, including the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. But while Augustus claimed to have restored the Republic, he retained control of the army, the treasury, and the most important provinces. The system Augustus created, known as the Principate, was a masterpiece of political theater. Augustus was not a king, Romans still hated that title, but the first citizen who happened to hold a collection of republican offices that gave him supreme power. The Senate continued to meet, consuls were elected annually, and the old rituals of republican government were maintained. But everyone understood where real power lay. Augustus ruled for 45 years, transforming not just the Roman government, but Roman society itself. He found Rome a city of brick, he claimed, and left it a city of marble. More importantly, he established a system that would endure for centuries, providing the stability that allowed Roman civilization to flourish across the Mediterranean world. The death of Augustus in 14 AD marked the end of the Roman Republic's last generation and the beginning of what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the next 2 centuries, the Mediterranean world would experience unprecedented prosperity, security, and cultural flowering under imperial rule. It was the closest thing to a golden age that the ancient world ever achieved. This is not to say that the empire was free from problems. Augustus's immediate successors included some of history's most notorious figures. The paranoid recluse Tiberius, who spent his final years on the island of Capri, engaging in activities that scandalized even Romans. Caligula, whose brief reign was marked by megalomaniacal excess and bizarre behavior. Claudius, who conquered Britain and was possibly poisoned by his wife. And Nero, who may or may not have fiddled while Rome burned. But the genius of Augustus's system was that it could function despite having terrible emperors. The vast imperial bureaucracy he had created continued to operate regardless of who sat on the throne. Provincial governors administered justice, tax collectors gathered revenue, and army commanders defended the frontiers whether the emperor was competent or completely insane. The real test of the system came in 69 AD, the year of 4 emperors, when Nero's suicide triggered a civil war that saw 4 different men claim the purple in quick succession. But this crisis, which might have torn the early republic apart, was resolved relatively quickly. The victor, Vespasian, was a practical soldier from a middle-class family who stabilized the empire and founded a new dynasty. Vespasian's greatest achievement was the construction of the Colosseum, officially known as the Flavian Amphitheater. This massive structure, which could seat 50,000 spectators, became the symbol of Roman power and engineering prowess. But it also represented something darker about Roman civilization: the casual acceptance of violence as entertainment. The games held in the Colosseum were spectacular and horrifying. Gladiators fought to the death. Criminals were executed in elaborate theatrical recreations of mythological scenes, and exotic animals were slaughtered by the thousands. These spectacles served multiple purposes. They entertained the masses, demonstrated Roman power over nature and enemies, and provided an outlet for the violent impulses that had once torn the Republic apart. Yet, for all its brutality, the Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD achieved remarkable things. Roman law provided a consistent legal framework across diverse peoples and cultures. Roman engineering connected the Mediterranean world with an unprecedented network of roads, aqueducts, harbors, and public buildings. Roman peace allowed trade to flourish and cities to grow. Perhaps most importantly, Roman citizenship gradually expanded to include more and more of the empire's inhabitants. Where other ancient empires had sharp distinctions between rulers and subjects, Rome offered a path to inclusion. A Greek could become Roman, a Gaul could rise to the Senate, a Spaniard could even become emperor. This inclusiveness was not motivated by modern ideas of equality, but by the practical Roman recognition that diversity was strength. The Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD, represented the empire at its peak. He was born in Spain to a Roman colonial family, served with distinction in the army, and expanded Roman territory to its greatest extent, conquering Dacia and briefly holding Mesopotamia. His column in Rome, decorated with spiraling reliefs depicting his Dacian campaigns, still stands as a monument to Roman military prowess. But perhaps more impressive than Trajan's conquests were his public works. He built new forums, new baths, new harbors, and the massive market complex that still bears his name. Like the best Roman emperors, he understood that power was not just about winning battles, but about improving the lives of ordinary people. Roman emperors were expected to provide bread and circuses, food and entertainment, to keep the urban masses content. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, embodied a different aspect of Roman excellence. Where Trajan had been a conqueror, Hadrian was a builder and administrator. He traveled constantly throughout the empire, founding cities, improving fortifications, and personally inspecting everything from military camps to legal proceedings. His wall across northern Britain, built to keep out the unconquered Pictish tribes, remains one of the most impressive Roman ruins in existence. Hadrian was also deeply interested in Greek culture and philosophy. He rebuilt Athens, founded Greek-style cities, and was notorious for his love affair with a young Greek man named Antinous, whose death led to unprecedented displays of imperial grief. This combination of Roman practicality and Greek intellectualism characterized the empire at its best. The last of the 5 good emperors was Marcus Aurelius, whose philosophical meditations provide a remarkable window into the mind of an ancient ruler. Here was a man who commanded absolute power over 60 million people, yet spent his spare time writing stoic reflections on duty, mortality, and the proper way to live. His meditations, never intended for publication, reveal someone constantly struggling to live up to his own moral standards. Yet even Marcus Aurelius faced challenges that previewed the empire's coming troubles. He spent most of his reign fighting Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier, and his campaigns were defensive rather than expansionist. The easy conquests were over. Rome now faced enemies who had learned from centuries of contact with Roman military techniques. Moreover, Marcus's son Commodus proved to be a disaster as emperor, more interested in gladiatorial games than government. His assassination in 192 AD ended the Antonine dynasty and triggered another civil war. The age of the good emperors was over, and the empire was about to face its greatest crisis. The 3rd century AD was the closest Rome came to complete collapse. Between 235 and 284 AD, over 20 emperors ruled the empire, most of them dying violent deaths. Barbarian tribes crossed the frontiers almost at will, the economy collapsed, plague devastated the population, and the empire briefly split into 3 separate pieces. It was a catastrophe on the scale of the fall of the Republic, but this time there would be no Augustus to restore order easily. The crisis began with the weakness of the imperial system itself. Roman emperors had always depended on the army for their power, but by the 3rd century, this relationship had become toxic. Soldiers demanded higher pay, which emperors provided by debasing the currency, which caused inflation, which required even higher pay. Moreover, armies in different provinces began proclaiming their own commanders as emperor, leading to constant civil wars. The barracks emperors of this period were mostly career soldiers who had risen through the ranks. They understood war, but not statecraft, and their reigns were typically brief and violent. An emperor might defeat external enemies only to be murdered by his own troops, who would then proclaim his successor, who would face the same cycle of violence. External pressures made the situation worse. New confederation of Germanic tribes, Franks, Alemanni, Goths, and others, pressed against the Rhine and Danube frontiers with unprecedented coordination and strength. In the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire proved more aggressive than its Parthian predecessor, conquering Roman territories and even capturing the Emperor Valerian in 260 AD. Perhaps most symbolically devastating, barbarian tribes reached Italy itself for the first time in centuries. Rome, which hadn't been threatened by foreign enemies since Hannibal, was forced to rebuild its walls. The psychological impact was enormous. The Eternal City was no longer safe. The empire's response to these pressures was to fragment. In 260 AD, the Roman general Postumus established an independent Gallic empire covering Britain, Gaul, and Spain. His stated goal was not to destroy Rome, but to defend these provinces more effectively than distant emperors could. Meanwhile, in the east, the city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, carved out its own empire covering Syria, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia. For a time, 3 separate Roman empires existed simultaneously, each claiming legitimacy while controlling different territories. The Central Empire, reduced to Italy and the Balkans, seemed on the verge of complete collapse. Trade networks broke down, cities contracted, and many people wondered if this was the end of Roman civilization. The empire was saved by a series of remarkable soldier emperors who combined military skill with administrative genius. Claudius Gothicus defeated a massive Gothic invasion, earning his nickname. Aurelian reconquered the Palmyrene Empire and the Gallic Empire, reuniting the Roman world under a single ruler and earning the title Restorer of the World. But the most important reforms came under Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 AD. Diocletian recognized that the empire had grown too large and complex for a single ruler. His solution was the Tetrarchy, rule by 4 emperors, with 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars dividing administrative and military responsibilities. Diocletian also moved the imperial capital away from Rome, establishing his court at Nicomedia in Asia Minor. Rome remained symbolically important, but the practical center of power shifted eastward toward the empire's wealthiest and most populous regions. This geographic rebalancing would have profound consequences for the future. Most importantly, Diocletian separated military and civilian commands, ending the cycle where generals became emperors by controlling armies. He also reformed the currency, reorganized the tax system, and established maximum prices for goods to combat inflation. These reforms worked. The empire stabilized and would endure for centuries more. But the cost was enormous. The Roman Empire that emerged from the 3rd century crisis was very different from the one that had entered it. The free-flowing classical civilization of the Antonine Age was replaced by a more regimented, bureaucratic system. Personal liberty was sacrificed for collective security. The empire survived, but it was no longer the same organism. The transformation of the Roman Empire was completed by Constantine the Great, who ruled from 306 to 337 AD. Constantine's reign marked several crucial turning points: the adoption of Christianity as the empire's preferred religion, the foundation of Constantinople as a new Rome, and the final abandonment of republican institutions in favor of absolute monarchy. Constantine came to power through civil war, defeating his rivals at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. According to Christian sources, he experienced a vision before the battle in which he saw a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether this vision was real, invented, or politically motivated remains debated, but Constantine certainly attributed his victory to the Christian God. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD legalized Christianity throughout the empire, ending centuries of sporadic persecution. This was not yet the establishment of Christianity as the official religion, that would come later, but it marked a fundamental shift in the empire's relationship with its largest religious minority. Constantine's personal commitment to Christianity deepened over time. He delayed baptism until his deathbed, as was common practice, but he clearly favored Christian officials, built magnificent churches, and involved himself in theological disputes. Most significantly, he summoned the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to resolve the Arian controversy, establishing the principle that the emperor had authority over church doctrine. Perhaps even more important than his religious policies was Constantine's decision to found a new capital. Constantinople, built on the site of ancient Byzantium, was designed as a Christian Rome, a city without pagan temples or republican traditions. Its strategic location controlling the Bosphorus made it the natural center for governing the empire's eastern provinces. The founding of Constantinople also reflected the empire's eastward shift. The wealthy cities of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt had long been more prosperous than the Latin West. By establishing his capital in the Greek-speaking East, Constantine acknowledged where the empire's future lay. Under Constantine and his successors, the Roman Empire became increasingly Christian and increasingly autocratic. The emperor was no longer the first citizen of a restored republic, but the vice-regent of God on earth, ruling by divine right. Court ceremonies became elaborate rituals emphasizing the emperor's sacred status, while access to the imperial presence became increasingly restricted. This transformation was not immediate or uniform. Julian the Apostate briefly attempted to restore paganism in the 360s, while various emperors struggled with the relationship between imperial authority and Christian doctrine. But the general trend was clear. The Roman Empire was becoming a Christian monarchy, very different from the pagan republic that had conquered the Mediterranean. The Christianization of the empire had profound cultural consequences. Classical literature, art, and philosophy came under suspicion for their pagan origins. Ancient temples were closed or converted into churches. The Olympic Games, tainted by their association with Greek polytheism, were eventually abolished. Yet Christianity also preserved much classical learning. Christian scholars like Augustine synthesized classical philosophy with Christian theology, while monastic communities preserved ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost. The relationship between Christianity and classical culture was complex, involving both destruction and preservation. By 380 AD, under Theodosius Thurcer, Christianity became the empire's official religion. Paganism was officially banned, though it survived in rural areas for centuries. The transformation that had begun with Constantine's vision was complete. Rome had become a Christian empire, and Christianity had become a Roman religion. The death of Theodosius the First in 395 AD marked the permanent division of the Roman Empire into eastern and western halves, each ruled by one of his sons. This partition, intended as a temporary administrative convenience, became a permanent reality that would shape European and Mediterranean history for the next 1,000 years. The Western Empire, with its capital at Rome and later Ravenna, included Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and North Africa. The Eastern Empire, governed from Constantinople, controlled the Balkans, Asia Minor, the Levant, and Egypt. In theory, both emperors ruled a single Roman Empire, but in practice, they often acted as rivals rather than partners. The division reflected real differences between the empire's two halves. The West was poorer, less urbanized, and more vulnerable to barbarian invasion. Its economy depended heavily on agriculture, and its cities had been declining since the 3rd century crisis. The East, by contrast, controlled the ancient centers of trade and culture: Athens, Ephesus, Antioch, Alexandria, and its economy remained robust. These economic differences became crucial as both halves of the empire faced increasing pressure from barbarian peoples beyond the frontiers. The Huns, migrating westward from the Asian steppes, displaced Germanic tribes who sought refuge within Roman territory. What followed was not so much an invasion as a massive migration that the empire struggled to control. The Western emperors, lacking the resources to resist these migrations militarily, attempted to manage them through diplomacy and integration. Germanic tribes were settled in Roman territory as foederati, allied peoples who provided military service in exchange for land and Roman recognition of their leaders. This policy worked temporarily, but gradually undermined Roman authority as barbarian kings became more powerful than Roman officials. The Eastern emperors, blessed with greater resources and shorter frontiers, could afford to be more selective. They often deflected barbarian pressure westward, essentially bribing tribes to attack the Western Empire instead of their own territories. This strategy worked from Constantinople's perspective, but doomed any hope of Western recovery. The most dramatic example of barbarian migration was the career of Attila the Hun. His confederation of tribes terrorized both halves of the empire during the 440s and 450s, extracting enormous tribute payments and threatening Rome itself. The famous meeting between Attila and Pope Leo I in 452 AD, where the Pope allegedly persuaded the Hun leader to spare Rome, symbolized how Christian leaders were replacing imperial officials as the real authorities in the West. The Western Empire's final century was marked by a succession of weak emperors dominated by barbarian generals. These Germanic commanders, Stilicho, Ricimer, Odoacer, were often more Roman than their nominal masters, having grown up within the imperial system and internalized Roman values. But their primary loyalty was to their own peoples, rather than to abstract concepts like the Roman state. Britain was abandoned first, around 410 AD, when the Emperor Honorius allegedly told the Romano-British to look to their own defenses. North Africa fell to the Vandals in the 430s, cutting off a crucial source of tax revenue and grain supplies. Gaul was divided among Franks, Visigoths, and Burgundians. By 450 AD, the Western Empire controlled little beyond Italy. The Eastern Empire, meanwhile, not only survived, but occasionally attempted to reconquer lost Western territories. The Emperor Majorian briefly restored Roman authority in Gaul and Spain during the 450s, but his success was short-lived. The East had its own problems with Huns, Persians, and internal religious disputes. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 AD, when the Germanic king Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. But this event was less dramatic than it might appear. By 476, the Western Empire had been reduced to little more than Italy, and even there, real power rested with barbarian commanders rather than emperors. Romulus Augustulus was a child, perhaps 14 years old, elevated to the throne by his father, the general Orestes. When Orestes refused to grant his Germanic troops the land they demanded, they rebelled under Odoacer's leadership. The deposition of Romulus was almost bloodless. He was simply pensioned off to live quietly in Campania. Odoacer's letter to the Eastern Emperor Zeno claimed that the West no longer needed its own emperor. One ruler in Constantinople was sufficient for the entire empire. This was a face-saving fiction that allowed everyone to pretend that imperial unity had been restored rather than that the West had been conquered by barbarians. In reality, the Western Roman Empire had been transforming into a collection of Germanic kingdoms for decades. The Visigoths ruled Spain, the Vandals controlled North Africa, the Franks dominated northern Gaul, and various other tribes had carved out territories throughout the former western provinces. These kingdoms maintained many Roman institutions and customs, but they were no longer Roman in any meaningful sense. The fall of Rome in 476 was therefore more like the final recognition of a process that had been underway for generations. Roman civilization in the West didn't disappear overnight. Latin remained the language of law, administration, and educated discourse. Roman law continued to govern legal relationships. Former Roman cities remained centers of trade and culture. What disappeared was the unified Roman state that had governed the Mediterranean world for centuries. In its place emerged a patchwork of kingdoms that preserved some Roman traditions while developing their own distinct characteristics. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, established by Theodoric in 493 AD, consciously attempted to maintain Roman traditions, even restoring the Senate and staging traditional games in the Circus Maximus. Yet even as the Western Empire collapsed politically, Roman influence persisted culturally. The Germanic kings who replaced Roman emperors often took Roman titles, employed Roman administrators, and followed Roman legal precedents. They understood that Rome's power had rested not just on military force, but on a superior system of government and law. The Catholic Church played a crucial role in preserving Roman traditions. As imperial authority collapsed, bishops often became the effective rulers of their cities. The Pope, as Bishop of Rome, claimed authority not just over spiritual matters but over temporal affairs as well. In many ways, the medieval papacy inherited the universalist ambitions of the Roman Empire. Latin, too, ensured the survival of Roman influence. As the language of the Church, of law, and of educated discourse, Latin continued to evolve in the post-imperial West. The Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, are all descendants of Latin, preserving Roman linguistic influence across much of Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the idea of Rome survived the fall of the Roman state. Medieval rulers from Charlemagne to Napoleon claimed to be restoring or continuing the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, founded in 800 AD, explicitly claimed to be the successor to ancient Rome. Even today, concepts like republic, citizenship, and law derive from Roman precedents. While the Western Roman Empire fragmented into Germanic kingdoms, the Eastern Empire not only survived but flourished. Based in Constantinople, this eastern continuation of Rome would endure for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, Roman institutions, and Roman identity long after the Western collapse. Modern historians often call this eastern continuation the Byzantine Empire. But its inhabitants knew themselves as Romans. They called their realm Romania, and their emperor the Basileus ton Romaion, Emperor of the Romans. Their laws were Roman, their administration was Roman, and their sense of identity was firmly rooted in the Roman past. The Eastern emperors never accepted the Western collapse as permanent. Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, launched ambitious campaigns to reconquer the lost Western territories. His general Belisarius recaptured North Africa from the Vandals and much of Italy from the Ostrogoths, briefly restoring Roman rule to these regions. But Justinian's conquests proved unsustainable. The resources devoted to Western campaigns left the eastern frontiers vulnerable to Persian attack, while plague and excessive taxation weakened the empire internally. Within a generation of Justinian's death, most of his conquests had been lost to new invaders: Lombards in Italy, Slavs in the Balkans, and Arabs across the southern Mediterranean. The Arab conquests of the 7th century were perhaps more devastating to the Eastern Empire than the Germanic invasions had been to the West. Within decades, the Arabs had conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, some of the empire's richest and most populous provinces. Constantinople itself was besieged multiple times, but held firm behind its massive walls and the secret weapon of Greek fire. These losses forced the Eastern Empire to reinvent itself. The Greek-speaking provinces of Asia Minor and the Balkans became the empire's core, while Latin gradually disappeared from official use. The theme system, which combined military and civil administration under regional commanders, replaced the older system of separate military and civilian hierarchies. Despite these challenges, the Eastern Roman Empire entered a golden age during the 9th and 10th centuries. The Macedonian dynasty presided over military victories that restored much of Asia Minor and extended Byzantine influence into the Balkans and southern Italy. Constantinople became the largest and wealthiest city in Europe, a cosmopolitan center of trade, art, and learning. Byzantine scholars preserved much of classical Greek literature that would otherwise have been lost. The Bibliotheca compiled by Photius in the 9th century summarizes hundreds of ancient works, many of which survive only in his descriptions. Monastic libraries preserved manuscripts of Greek classics, mathematical treatises, and scientific works that would later be transmitted to the Islamic world and medieval Europe. The Byzantine Empire also developed its own distinctive artistic and architectural traditions. The Hagia Sophia, built under Justinian, remained the largest enclosed space in the world for nearly 1,000 years. Byzantine mosaics, with their gold backgrounds and stylized figures, created a visual language that influenced art from Russia to Sicily. Religious controversies marked much of Byzantine history. The iconoclastic period of the 8th and 9th centuries saw emperors attempting to ban religious images, leading to civil conflicts and theological disputes that lasted for over a century. The schism between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christianity, formalized in 1054 AD, reflected not just theological differences but cultural and political divisions between Greek East and Latin West. Yet for all its achievements, the Eastern Roman Empire faced the same fundamental challenges that had destroyed the West: barbarian pressure, internal divisions, and the costs of defending extensive frontiers. The rise of the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century cost the empire most of Asia Minor, while the Fourth Crusade in 1204 saw Western Christians sack Constantinople itself, fragmenting the empire for over 50 years. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from the Latin occupation of Constantinople in 1261 was a shadow of its former glory. Reduced to Constantinople, parts of Greece, and scattered territories in Asia Minor, it faced the rising power of the Ottoman Turks while struggling with internal divisions and economic decline. The civil wars of the 14th century further weakened the empire. The dispute between John V of Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzenos split Byzantine society and allowed the Ottomans to establish their first permanent foothold in Europe. By 1400, the Byzantine Empire controlled little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered enclaves. Yet, even in decline, Byzantium remained culturally vibrant. The Paleologan Renaissance of the 13th and 14th centuries produced remarkable art, literature, and scholarship. Byzantine scholars like Gemistos Platon helped transmit Greek learning to the Italian Renaissance, while the empire's diplomatic traditions influenced European statecraft. The Ottoman siege of Constantinople in 1453 was the inevitable conclusion of centuries of decline. Sultan Mehmed II brought massive cannons that could breach the city's ancient walls, while the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V, died fighting on the ramparts. The fall of Constantinople ended the last remnant of the Roman Empire, though Greek culture continued to flourish under Ottoman rule. The significance of 1453 extends beyond the end of a medieval empire. With the fall of Constantinople, many Greek scholars fled to Western Europe, bringing with them manuscripts and knowledge that enriched the Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire that replaced Byzantium inherited much from its predecessor, maintaining the administrative efficiency and cultural sophistication that had characterized the Eastern Roman Empire. The story of Rome did not end with the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Roman influence continued to shape European civilization through law, language, architecture, and political thought. The medieval Holy Roman Empire claimed to continue Roman traditions, while the papacy preserved Roman administrative methods and Latin culture. Roman law, codified under Justinian, became the foundation for legal systems across Europe. The concepts of citizenship, constitutional government, and the rule of law all derive from Roman precedents. Even revolutionary movements like the American and French revolutions looked to the Roman Republic for inspiration, seeing in figures like Cincinnatus and Brutus models of civic virtue. The Latin language ensured Roman cultural survival long after the empire's political collapse. Not only did it evolve into the Romance languages, but it remained the language of scholarship, diplomacy, and the Catholic Church until modern times. Latin literature provided models for medieval and Renaissance writers, while Roman historical examples influenced political thought for centuries. Roman engineering achievements continued to amaze later generations. Aqueducts built under the empire supplied water to European cities well into the modern period, while Roman roads remained the backbone of European transportation networks. The architectural principles developed by Roman builders influenced everything from medieval cathedrals to Renaissance palaces to modern government buildings. Perhaps most importantly, Rome provided the template for imperial ambitions that would recur throughout history. Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon's continental system, and even modern European Union all echo Roman dreams of Mediterranean unity. The idea that diverse peoples can be united under common laws and institutions remains one of Rome's most enduring contributions to political thought. The Roman Empire's approach to cultural diversity also prefigured modern concepts of multiculturalism. While Roman attitudes toward conquered peoples were hardly enlightened by contemporary standards, their willingness to extend citizenship and incorporate foreign traditions contrasted sharply with the ethnic exclusivity of many ancient societies. Even Rome's failures provide valuable lessons. The corruption of the late Republic, the military anarchy of the 3rd century, and the religious conflicts of the late Empire all demonstrate the fragility of political institutions and the importance of civic virtue. The Roman experience reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations are mortal. The story we've traced tonight spans over 2 millennia, from the mythical founding of Rome in 753 BC to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. It's a narrative of remarkable success followed by inevitable decline, of human achievement shadowed by human folly, of grand ambitions ultimately constrained by geography, economics, and the limitations of pre-modern technology. What made Rome successful was not any single factor, but a combination of circumstances: geographic advantages, political flexibility, military innovation, cultural openness, and perhaps most importantly, an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. When the monarchy became oppressive, Romans created a republic. When the republic proved inadequate for governing an empire, they accepted imperial rule. When traditional gods seemed insufficient, they embraced Christianity. This adaptability allowed Rome to survive crises that destroyed other ancient civilizations. The sack by Gauls in 390 BC, Hannibal's invasion during the Second Punic War, the civil wars of the late Republic, the 3rd century crisis. Any one of these catastrophes could have ended Roman history. Instead, Romans learned from each crisis and emerged stronger. Yet, adaptation has its limits. The Roman Empire that Constantine established was very different from the republic that had conquered the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire that fell in 1453 bore little resemblance to the classical civilization of Augustus and Marcus Aurelius. In preserving themselves, the Romans gradually transformed into something else entirely. The ultimate causes of Roman decline are still debated by historians. Some emphasize external factors: barbarian pressure, plague, climate change, the rise of Christianity. Others focus on internal problems: political instability, economic inequality, military costs, moral decay. In reality, the fall of Rome resulted from a complex interaction of factors that proved too much for even Roman adaptability to overcome. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Roman civilization is not that it eventually fell — all human institutions are temporary — but that it lasted so long and achieved so much. Few states in human history have maintained political unity over such vast territories for such extended periods. Fewer still have left such enduring cultural legacies. The Roman Empire at its peak governed perhaps 60 million people across 3 continents. It provided them with a common legal system, a shared currency, safe transportation networks, and relative peace. While this system was built on slavery and conquest, while it was hierarchical and often brutal, it represented the most successful attempt at Mediterranean unification until the modern European Union. Rome's cultural achievements were equally impressive. Roman literature, art, architecture, and law provided models that influenced European civilization for millennia. Roman concepts of citizenship, constitutional government, and imperial administration shaped political thought from the Middle Ages through the Enlightenment. Even today, when we speak of republics, senates, or citizens, we use Roman terms for Roman concepts. As we near the end of our long journey through Roman history, it seems fitting to return to Rome itself, not the empire that once stretched across 3 continents, but the city where it all began. Throughout its history, Rome, the city, remained symbolically central to Roman identity. Even when political power shifted to Constantinople, or when barbarian kings ruled from Ravenna, modern visitors to Rome can still trace the layers of its history. The Forum Romanum, where Cicero delivered his orations and Caesar was assassinated, lies in ruins but remains recognizable. The Colosseum still dominates the city's skyline, while aqueduct arches march across the countryside as they did 2,000 years ago. The Pantheon, built under Hadrian, remains one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. Yet Rome is not a museum. The city that began as a collection of mud huts on 7 hills continues to evolve. Medieval churches incorporate ancient columns, Renaissance palaces rise from classical foundations, and modern Romans navigate streets first laid out by ancient urban planners. The continuity is remarkable. In Rome, the present and past coexist in ways found nowhere else on earth. The Bishop of Rome, claiming authority as successor to St. Peter, gradually emerged as the Pope, head of the Catholic Church. In many ways, the medieval papacy inherited the universalist ambitions of the Roman Empire. Just as Roman law had once governed the Mediterranean world, canon law now governed Catholic Europe. Just as Roman engineers had built roads to connect the empire, papal legates created networks that bound medieval Christendom together. The language of ancient Rome evolved, but never disappeared. Church Latin preserved classical grammar and vocabulary, while spoken Latin gradually developed into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Today, billions of people speak languages descended from the tongue of Caesar and Augustus, making Latin perhaps the most successful language in human history. Roman law proved equally durable. Justinian's codification became the foundation for legal systems across Europe and European colonies. Concepts like innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal representation, and equality before the law all have Roman origins. Modern legal terminology remains heavily Latin, preserving Roman legal concepts in contemporary jurisprudence. Even Roman engineering principles continue to influence modern construction. The arch, the dome, and concrete construction all have Roman precedents. Modern city planning, with its emphasis on straight streets, public squares, and sanitation systems, follows patterns established by Roman urban designers. When we turn on a tap and expect clean water, or flush a toilet and expect waste to disappear, we're benefiting from Roman innovations. As we settle deeper into our blankets and let the long story of Rome wash over us, it's worth considering why this ancient civilization continues to fascinate us. Part of the answer lies in scale. Rome's achievements were simply enormous, matching the ambitions of any society in human history. But scale alone doesn't explain Rome's enduring appeal. Perhaps we're drawn to Rome because it seems so familiar. Roman political debates about taxation, immigration, and military intervention could have been torn from today's headlines. Roman complaints about moral decay, political corruption, and economic inequality echo concerns voiced in every generation. The Romans faced many of the same challenges we face, giving us hope that our problems, too, might be overcome. Rome also appeals to us because it was fundamentally pragmatic. Where other ancient civilizations were dominated by priest-kings claiming divine authority, Rome developed institutions based on practical experience rather than religious doctrine. The Roman constitution evolved through trial and error, incorporating successful elements while discarding failures. This empirical approach to government seems very modern. At the same time, Rome's failures warn us about the fragility of civilized life. The transformation of the Roman Republic into an autocratic empire reminds us that democratic institutions require constant vigilance to survive. The civil wars of the late Republic demonstrate how quickly constitutional government can collapse when political norms are abandoned. The fall of the Western Roman Empire shows us how external pressures and internal weaknesses can combine to destroy even the mightiest states. Climate change, disease, economic inequality, political polarization, and military overstretch all contributed to Roman decline. These factors remain relevant today as we face our own global challenges. Yet Rome also demonstrates human resilience. Time and again, Romans faced existential crises and found ways to survive. The sack of Rome by Gauls, Hannibal's invasion, the 3rd century crisis, the barbarian migrations, each challenge seemed to spell doom for Roman civilization. Instead, Romans adapted, reformed, and continued. Their example reminds us that setbacks need not be permanent. Rome's cultural legacy may be its most important contribution to human civilization. The idea that diverse peoples can be united under common laws and institutions, that merit should matter more than birth, that government should serve the common good, these concepts all have Roman origins. While the Romans often failed to live up to their own ideals, those ideals continue to inspire us. Roman literature, art, and architecture provide aesthetic standards that have influenced Western culture for 2 millennia. The Aeneid remains one of the greatest epic poems ever written, while Roman historians like Tacitus and Livy established standards for historical writing that persist today. Roman architectural principles can be seen in government buildings, churches, and monuments around the world. Perhaps most importantly, Rome reminds us that civilization is both precious and fragile. The Romans created a world of unprecedented prosperity, security, and cultural achievement. But they also showed us how quickly such achievements can be lost through war, disease, political instability, and social decay. Their example should inspire us to protect and nurture the institutions that make civilized life possible. As our journey through Roman history draws to a close, we find ourselves back where we started, with stories. The Romans told stories about their origins to explain who they were and where they came from. We tell stories about the Romans to understand our own world and our place in it. History is ultimately about storytelling, about finding patterns and meanings in the chaos of human experience. The story of Rome is compelling because it contains all the elements of great drama: humble beginnings, spectacular rise, internal conflict, external challenges, moral choices, tragic flaws, and inevitable decline. It's a story that works on multiple levels, as political history, military history, social history, cultural history, and moral parable. But it's also a story that never really ends. Every generation rediscovers Rome and finds new meanings in its history. Medieval chroniclers saw Rome as the last great empire before Christ's return. Renaissance humanists found in Republican Rome a model for civic virtue. Enlightenment thinkers used Roman examples to critique monarchy and aristocracy. Modern historians have examined Roman slavery, the role of women, and environmental factors in imperial decline. Each age sees different aspects of Roman history as relevant to its own concerns. During the Cold War, historians emphasized the parallels between Roman expansion and American global influence. Today, scholars focus on issues like immigration, multiculturalism, and the sustainability of imperial systems. Rome serves as a mirror for our own societies, reflecting our hopes, fears, and preoccupations. The physical remains of Roman civilization continue to surprise and inspire us. Archaeological discoveries regularly revise our understanding of Roman life. New techniques allow us to read texts from charred papyri found at Pompeii, analyze DNA from Roman skeletons, and reconstruct ancient climates from ice cores and tree rings. The Romans continue to teach us even 2 millennia after their civilization's peak. Yet for all our scholarly analysis, perhaps the most important lesson Rome teaches us is humility. The Romans were not superhuman. They made mistakes, succumbed to greed and ambition, failed to live up to their own ideals, but they also achieved remarkable things through cooperation, determination, and adaptability. Their example reminds us that ordinary people, working together over long periods, can accomplish extraordinary things. The story of Rome also reminds us of the importance of long-term thinking. Roman civilization was built by generations of people who worked on projects they would never see completed. They planted trees whose shade they would never enjoy, built roads they would never travel, and established institutions that would outlast them by centuries. This willingness to invest in the future, to think beyond individual lifespans, was crucial to Roman success. As we drift toward sleep with the rise and fall of Rome echoing in our minds, we might reflect on what legacy our own generation will leave. Will future historians puzzle over our achievements and failures as we puzzle over Rome's? What stories will they tell about our time? What lessons will they draw from our successes and mistakes? In the end, Rome never truly fell because it never stopped transforming. The city-state became a republic, the republic became an empire, the pagan empire became Christian, the Western Empire fell while the Eastern endured, and through it all, the idea of Rome persisted. Today, when we speak of republics and citizenship, when we use Latin phrases in legal documents, when we admire domed buildings or marvel at ancient aqueducts, Rome lives on. The Romans believed in the eternal return, the idea that all things cycle through endless repetition. Perhaps they were right. The challenges they faced, political polarization, economic inequality, military overstretch, immigration, climate change, disease, are challenges we face today. Their solutions, pragmatic adaptation, institutional flexibility, cultural synthesis, may offer guidance for our own problems. But Rome also warns us that no solution is permanent. No achievement is eternal. The mightiest empire eventually crumbles. The wisest laws eventually become obsolete. The greatest cities eventually fall into ruins. This is not cause for despair, but for action. Knowing that our own civilization is temporary should motivate us to make the most of our time, to build well, to think of future generations, to create things worth preserving. The story of Rome is ultimately a human story. It's about people like us facing challenges like ours, making choices like the ones we face every day. Some Romans chose personal gain over public good. Others sacrificed everything for their ideals. Some adapted to change. Others clung to outdated traditions. Some built bridges between different peoples. Others built walls to keep foreigners out. These individual choices, multiplied across millions of people over hundreds of years, created the Roman civilization we've explored tonight. Our individual choices, multiplied across billions of people in our own time, will create the world future generations inherit. The Romans remind us that history is not made by abstract forces, but by human decisions, by people choosing to cooperate or compete, to include or exclude, to build up or tear down. As sleep begins to claim us, as the long story of Rome settles into our dreams, we might remember that we are all inheritors of the Roman legacy. We speak languages derived from Latin, live under laws based on Roman precedents, participate in political systems that echo Roman innovations. The blood of Roman citizens, slaves, soldiers, and farmers flows in our veins. Their dreams, achievements, and failures are part of our heritage. The 7 hills beside the Tiber River, where shepherds once grazed their flocks, became the center of the world. A collection of mud huts grew into marble temples. A band of refugees became master of 3 continents. A small city-state created a civilization that still shapes our world. It's a reminder that from small beginnings can come great achievements, that human potential is boundless when directed by wisdom and sustained by cooperation. So rest now, knowing that you are part of a story that began long before your birth and will continue long after your death. You are connected to Romulus and Remus, to Caesar and Augustus, to Marcus Aurelius and Constantine, to all the forgotten farmers, soldiers, and citizens who built something greater than themselves. Their legacy lives in you, as your legacy will live in future generations, who may one day tell stories about our own remarkable, flawed, heroic, and tragic civilization. The eternal city sleeps, but Rome never truly dies. It lives on in law and language, in art and architecture, in the very idea that diverse peoples can be united under common institutions and shared ideals. As you drift into your own peaceful slumber, remember that you too are part of Rome's eternal story, citizen of a world the Romans helped create, heir to their achievements, and guardian of their legacy. The story ends where it began, with the recognition that all human things are temporary, all civilizations mortal, all empires destined to fall. Yet it also ends with the understanding that what we build together, The laws, languages, arts, and ideas that outlast individual lives can achieve a kind of immortality. Rome fell, but Roman civilization endures. Our own world will pass away, but what we create together, the legacy we leave for future generations, may prove equally eternal. So sleep well, citizens of the eternal city that exists not in any single place, but in the human heart that dreams of justice, yearns for beauty, and believes that together we can build something worthy of remembrance. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the glory that was Rome and the hope of glories yet to come.